DAF, Lamed, Vav, and Aleph, at the very top of the page. Nistak, Nikev. We had learned in the Mishnah, that if the esrog is cracked, or if the esrog develops a hole, then it will be puzzle, provided that the hole creates a deficiency in the mass of the esrog. If the hole, however, is a needle hole, which just is inserted and it doesn't remove, it just displaces the mass, so then it doesn't render the esrog puzzle. So Tani Ula bar Rabbi Chanina, Nikev nekev mefulash b'mashahu v'she'ena mefulash b'ki'isr. He qualifies that statement that sometimes putting a needle into an esrog will still render it kosher. He says that's only true if it doesn't go all the way through from one end to the other. But if you stick a long needle from one end of the esrog and it comes out the other end, that's going to be puzzle even if no mass was removed as a result of that hole. And furthermore, even if it doesn't go all the way through, but the needle, or actually this would be a very thick peg that you insert into the esrog, even if it doesn't go all the way through, but if it is so thick that it leaves a mark the size of a coin, an Isser coin, so then that will also render the esrog puzzle, even if no mass was removed from the esrog in the course of making that puncture. But because it is so noticeable and it is so unsightly, it renders the esrog puzzle. Boy Rava. So Rava now asks a question. Noldu be'esrog simone treifa mahu. What would happen if the esrog develops symptoms that are similar or parallel to the symptoms that develop in an animal that render it a treifa? In other words, what the question basically is that there are multiple discussions in the Gemara in Chulin as to what renders an animal treifa. What about a corresponding discussion regarding the laws of esrog? So the Gemara says, "Mai kami bayale, iniklav tanina, inistak tanina, inikav tanina." So the Gemara says, I don't understand why he's raising this issue of creating a parallel between treifa animals and esrog. We've already discussed three different scenarios of an esrog in the Mishnah, which already parallel the discussion of treifa animals. So, for example, we have a case of niklaf, where the outer yellow of the esrog is peeled away. We talked about that yesterday. And that's very similar to an animal who is develops a removal of its hide, right? That could render the animal a treifa. Inistak tanina. Talking about a crack, so there is a parallel discussion regarding the vertebrae of an animal. If its vertebrae is cracked in a certain way, it will be rendered a treifa. If it's cracked in another way, it won't be rendered a treifa. But that too is undertaken in our Mishnah. And inikav tanina. And also as far as developing a hole, which is also discussed, let's say the membrane of the brain is pierced through with a needle, which is discussed in Maseches Chulin. Well, we've already undertaken a discussion of developing a hole in an esrog. So why are you trying to create this parallel if we've already discussed all the issues? The Gemara answers, there is one other issue that has a parallel in the laws of treifa that we haven't discussed here, and that is ula in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which is as follows. If you have a lung of an animal, while the animal is alive, the inner lining of the lung liquefies to a certain degree, so that the tissue becomes like mucus instead of remaining its normal thickness. Okay, but the outer membrane of the lung is intact, so it contains the organ, and it becomes somewhat liquidy.
The lung is normal.
The lung, well, the outer part of the lung is normal, but the inner walls of the lung become liquefied in some way.
But the lung tissue itself. You're talking about these two membranes, but the lung tissue.
No, it sounds like the lung tissue is the part that becomes liquidy, becomes mucus-like. So that animal is still called kosher because we assume that the tissue will heal at some point. This is a temporary condition that will eventually the animal will recover from this condition. I don't know what that would be physiologically.
Is the whole lung that becomes like that? Because how can the animal breathe?
Well, apparently, so Rashi explains the outer membrane or the outer layer of the lung is still intact, and it's only the inner part of the walls of the lung that are in some way compromised in this way. I'm out of my element. I'm sorry.
The lung usually, is a tissue, and then there's two membranes that are opposed to each other. So
It says the alveoli and the bronchi are still intact. Is there some other tissue?
Well, we're gonna get to that in just a second. Okay. So va'amar Rava v'hu dekaima simpunha, halokaima simpunha treifa. So Rava said that's only true if the alveoli and the bronchi are still intact. Those are the simpunha, which are like the different compartments within the lung. If those are still intact, then even if the walls of the lung have somewhat liquefied, then the animal is still considered to be kosher. But if the alveoli and the bronchi are no longer intact, so then the animal is a treifa. So hachamai. So therefore the question is, what about a corresponding discussion regarding the estrog? If the outer part of the estrog becomes liquidy or mushy in some way, will we say that the estrog is kosher or not? Dil mahasam hu deshalit ba'avira hadar bari, aval hacha deshalit ba'avira sruche misrachas, dil maloshna. So our question is as follows. Would we say that over there we don't render the animal a treifa when the alveoli are intact and the bronchi are intact, because the animal will eventually recover from the inner walls being liquefied, because there's no air that retards that healing process? But over here by an estrog, because it's exposed to the outer air, to the elements, it will not recover from this condition. Or perhaps we would say that no, just like over there the animal is still kosher, so to here, even though the exterior is mushy, the estrog is still kosher.
Is the estrog still on the tree when this is happening?
Well, that's a very good question, Bob. The Gemara doesn't seem to distinguish between the two. Obviously, the reason why an animal heals is not just because it's not exposed to air, but because it's a living organism, and the miracle of life allows it to heal, right? Just to think about how, person develops a scratch and then it heals is just, it's a miracle when you think about it, how the body heals itself. So the same thing would be true by plants, ostensibly, if they're growing. But if it's not growing anymore, why doesn't the Gemara make that distinction? I don't know why. Anyway, Tashma. So come and listen. Esrog tafuach saruach kavush shaluk. That if you have an esrog that is swollen on the exterior, and saruach if it's putrid, and we'll explain what this means, kavush if it's been pickled or shaluk or boiled, kushi lavanu menumer, or if it's black, white, or spotted, all of those cases are puzzle. Esrog kakadur puzzle, if it's round like a ball, it's puzzle because it has to be oval shaped, this typical shape of an esrog. V'yesh omrim afhatiyom, and some say that even if it's a Siamese twin esrog, which means two esrogs that are connected to each other, would also be puzzle. Esrog habosar, the next case is if an esrog is unripe, it's just starting to develop into a fruit. So Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirin. Rabbi Akiva says that's puzzle, and the chachamim say it's kosher to be used as an esrog. And then finally, godlo bedafus ve'asokim in bria cheres puzzle. If while the esrog is growing, you place a vise or a mold around it to cause it to grow into the shape of the mold. So then, if it's a different shape than its original shape, then the esrog will be puzzle. We're going to discuss all of these cases momentarily, but what are we trying to infer from this brisa? Kitani mihas tafuach saruach. So it talks about a case of an esrog that is swollen and putrid. So my lav tafuach mi bachutz v'saruach mi bifnim. It sounds like we're talking about a case where it's swollen, it's puffed up because of some kind of excessive moisture on the outside. That's like the liquefied walls of the lung. And v'saruach mi bifnim, it's putrid on the inside. And that seems to be the parallel case, that you've got this inner membrane still intact, and it's telling me that it's going to be puzzle. So it sounds like that case is already discussed. In other words, it seems like that's a parallel case to the case of the lung where the alveoli are still intact. The seed casing is like the alveoli, Rashi says, and therefore that's still intact. And therefore maybe that's the same case, and we're basically contrasting and saying, whereas by the lung it's kosher, by the esrog it's puzzle. So the Gemara says, lo, idi v'idi mi bachutz v'lo kasha, ha de tafach afal gav de lo sarach, ha de sarach afal gav de lo tafach. So the Gemara answers, no, that's not a parallel case. It's talking about a totally different situation. Tafuach and saruach is not descriptive of the outside and inside respectively, but tafuach saruach is describing either or. Either the outside is tafuach, which is swollen, or saruach, it's putrid. And what those words actually mean, Rashi equivocates. He thinks that saruach means that it became rotten or that it develops a very bad smell because of worms. And tafuach means that it's swollen because of puffiness or from rain. And that would be what tafuach. But they're both descriptions of the exterior, not even addressing what's on the inside. And therefore, since it's not even talking about a parallel situation of describing the outer part plus the inner part, you have no parallel description that corresponds to the lung by the case of esrog. Amar Mar. So now let's go back to this brisa. Esrog kushi puzzle. If you have a black esrog, it's puzzle. Actually, literally means an Ethiopian esrog, which is black, just like the humans that come from Ethiopia. So frek the Gemara v'hatanya kushi kosher, dom elo kushi puzzle. But there's another brisa that says if it's Ethiopian, it's kosher. But if it looks like an Ethiopian esrog, but it grows somewhere else, then it's puzzle. So Amar Aryai kitnan nomi masnisan dom elukushi tnan. So Aryai says that's what the first brisa means also. When our brisa says that a black one is puzzle, it means that it looks like an Ethiopian esrog, but it doesn't grow in Ethiopia. So that's why it's because of its abnormality that we say that it's puzzle. But if it's normal to that all esrogim that grow in Ethiopia have this dark color to them, so then it's kosher. Rava Amar lo kasha halan v'haluhu. Rava gives a totally different answer. He says even Ethiopian esrogim are puzzle, depending upon where you live. If you live in Eretz Yisrael, where we don't normally import Ethiopian esrogim to Eretz Yisrael, so then it's going to be puzzle because it's an abnormal site, it's an anomaly, and therefore people don't find it to be attractive. However, if you live in Bavel, where there was a regular trade with Africa, and we regularly import Ethiopian esrogim, so therefore this is considered the norm, and therefore it's considered to be kosher. So you're seeing a very interesting explanation in Rava. Whatever people of the place judge to be normal looking will define the kashrus of the esrog, which is an unusual chiddush.
Are they saying that esrogim in Ethiopia are black? I mean,
yes.
Normally it's an odd thing. It's an odd coincidence. I mean, just because people are black, why would the esrogim be dark? You know, sort of.
Well, it's a fascinating insight is that it seems like the esrog corresponds in some way to human beings as part of one of the symbolisms of an esrog. And perhaps you see from here that Hashem deliberately chose the esrog because it does mimic or pattern itself after the humans that live around it. I could say a lot of things at this point, but I will refrain. Anyway. Esrog habosa, Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshir. Let's look at the next part of the brisa. By the way, the esrogim in Ethiopia have really good rhythm too. I just want to. Okay, esrog habosar. I couldn't resist. Esrog habosar. Rabbi Akiva posel v'chachamim machshirim. If you have an unripe esrog, so Rabbi Akiva says it's puzzle, and the chachamim say that it's kosher. So Amar Rabba, Rabbi Akiva of Reb Shimon Amar Davar Echad. Rabbi Akiva, who puzzles the unripe esrog, holds the same way as Rabbi Shimon. They really hold the same shita. Rabbi Akiva hada amran. Rabbi Akiva, we just said, because he says that that's not a kosher esrog. And Reb Shimon maihi. What's Reb Shimon? The Tnan, Reb Shimon poter esrogim bekoten. Rabbi Shimon says that if an esrog is at its incipient stage of growth and it's very tiny, it's not subject to tithes. So apparently, Rabbi Shimon is aligned with Rabbi Akiva, just like Rabbi Akiva says that it's not considered an esrog yet because it hasn't ripened, and therefore you can't fulfill the mitzvah with it. Rabbi Shimon holds that it's not a fruit yet, and therefore it's not subject to tithing. So Amar le Abaya dilma lohi. Aryai says maybe that's not necessarily a valid comparison, because ad kan lo kama Rabbi Akiva hacha de ba'inan hadar veleka aval hasam kirabanan svirale. I'll argue like this. Rabbi Akiva's reason for saying that an unripe esrog is not good for the mitzvahs, because part of the mitzvah is that it needs to be hadar, it needs to be attractive, it needs to be beautiful, and this is not beautiful, right? But it's still a fruit. Maybe Rabbi Akiva would agree that it's subject to tithing like the Chachamim, because it's still a fruit. It's just not a beautiful fruit. And inami adkan lo kama Reb Shimon hasam ela dichsiv aser ta'aser es kol tevu asar echa kederch shebnei adam motzin lizriya. Aval hacha kerabanan svirale. Alternatively, I'll argue just the opposite. Maybe Reb Shimon only says that such an unripe esrog is not subject to tithing because the pasuk by tithing says that it has to be a fruit. Fruits that are subject to tithing are such that they are planted in the normative and grown in the normative way that people normally grow things. But if, let's say, I harvest a fruit before it's ripened, and therefore I haven't grown it in the way that people normally grow things when they plant them, so maybe that's the reason, says Reb Shimon, it's not subject to tithing. But that's unique to tithes. But maybe when it comes to the laws of esrog, he would say that it's still a fruit, and you can still fulfill the mitzvah. It's still an esrog, you can still fulfill the mitzvah of esrog with it, and therefore the Gemara says v'sulo midi. There's really nothing to discuss here, which means that Rava's position or suggestion that Reb Shimon and Rabbi Akiva are aligned is completely rejected. It's almost like tiyuvta. It's almost like saying, we completely reject you. Okay, next part of the brisa was Gadlo badefus ve'asokim in bria acheres pasuk. If you put it into some kind of mold or press or vise, and so that it grows in a way that its shape is deformed, so then it's pasul. Amar Rava lo shanu elakim in bria acheres aval kibriyaso kasher. So Rava qualifies it, and he says that's only true when the press causes it to come out in a deformed shape. But if it retains its original shape, it's still kosher. So the Gemara says, Pshita, kamin bria acheres tanya. So the Gemara says, why do you need Rava to tell you that? Shkoyach, that's exactly what it said in the brisa. So what's Rava adding? The Gemara says, Lo tzricha diafida dape. The answer is, says the Gemara, that you put it in such a press where it's made like a water wheel. You ever see a water wheel that has planks? Or in an old riverboat where that's got paddles, right? So let's say you put it in a press in such a way where it causes the esrog to grow out like in protrusions that fan out, right? Like protrusion here, protrusion here, protrusion here, protrusion here, and then it's divided by those indentations of the press. What Rav is essentially telling you is that that's not enough of a deformity to make it puzzle, because that's a normative. Esrogim all the time have what we call blitos. They have protrusions that are very similar to that. So even though you've accentuated those protrusions by putting it in that mold, it is still essentially the same shape, and therefore it's still kosher. And that's what Rabbi was trying to point out, that you've really got to deform it significantly in order for it to be puzzle. Okay, let us go further. Itmar, esrog shenakvuhu achbarim. Now let's say you have an esrog that was eaten away partially by mice. Amar Rav, ein zeh hadar. So Rav says that is not a kosher esrog because it's not hadar, it's not attractive anymore. So the Gemara says, Eini, is this really so? V'ha Rabbi Chanina matbil ba v'nafik ba. We know that a story that Rabbi Chanina used to take his esrog on Sukkos, dip it into some salad dressing, or dressing of some kind, and then took a bite out of it, and then afterwards he went ahead and fulfilled the mitzvah with it. Which is very bizarre, of course. We would never do this, pay $150 for your esrog and then take a bite out of it. But that's what Rabbi Chanina did.
From the skin?
I guess, he took a bite from the skin. Yeah. So anyway, Ula Rabbi Chanina kasha masnisin. So the Gemara says, why are you only asking this as a kasha on Rav? The Mishnah itself says that if there's any deficiency in the esrog, it's puzzle. So how could Rabbi Chanina take a bite out of it and still use it as a kosher esrog? So the Gemara answers, Bishlam masnisin la Rabbi Chanina lo kasha kan be yom tov rishon kan be yom tov sheni. Ela la Rav kasha. So the Gemara says like this, and this is a very important chiddush that completely alters our understanding of the Mishnah. It's very possible that the Mishnah is only telling us about the first day when there's a mitzvah d'oraisa of taking the esrog, because the Torah says ulakachtem, which the Gemara later on learns ulakachtem could also be read as ulakach tam, that you shall take a complete fruit. But that only applies on the first day of Sukkos. But on all subsequent days of Sukkos, the Mishnah does not require a completely intact esrog, and it can be somewhat deficient. However, it's problematic according to Rav, because the idea of hadar applies throughout Sukkot, doesn't just apply on the first day. And if Rav is saying that it's not an esrog anymore because it's not attractive, then it could not. Then what right could Rabbi Chanina have even on the second day of Sukkot to take a bite out of it and then continue using it? So the Gemara says, Amar lecha Rav shiny achborim dimi isi. So Rav will tell you that I was only talking about when mice eat into the esrog, because it's disgusting now. Who wants to use an esrog that mice bit into? If Rabbi Chanina bit into it, I would still use it. His teeth marks are attractive, right? But when mice bite into it, then I wouldn't want to use it, and therefore it's not hadar anymore, and therefore none of the days of Sukkot is it usable.
It's not necessarily that someone else would want to use it, but since he bit it, he would be willing to use his own, since it's his own, whereas the mouse is more meat.
You could say that as well. I'm not sure which one is more correct, but that's a good interpretation too. Ika da Amri, Amar Rav ze hadar da Rabbi Chanina matbil ba v'nafik ba. Others learn that it was said in the opposite way, that Rav commented that if an esrog is deficient because someone took a bite out of it, then it is still called hadar, and to wit, Rabbi Chanina took a bite out of his esrog and still fulfilled the mitzvah with it. Well, Rabbi Chanina kasha masnisin. According to Rabbi Chanina, how could he do that in light of our Mishnah, which says a deficient esrog is puzzle? Lo kasha kan b'yom tov rishon, kan b'yom tov sheni. It's not a contradiction, because our Mishnah was only talking about the first day of Sukkot, where it has to be lakicha tama, it has to be a completely intact fruit, and Rabbi Chanina did this on the second day or subsequent days of Sukkot. Okay, let us go weiter. Esrog katan v'chulei. If you have a small esrog, our Mishnah had said that the minimal size of a small esrog is a machlokas between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Meir says it has to be minimally the size of a nut, either like a walnut or a hazelnut, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, it has to be the size of an egg, of the size of a beitza. Amar Rav from Bar Papa ke machlokas kan kach machlokas ba'avanim and mikur zalos. Just like there's a machlokas over here for the minimal size of an esrog, the parallel machlokas exists when it comes to wiping stones. What I mean by wiping stones are stones that are a little bit pointy at the end, because they used to use those to go to the bathroom instead of toilet paper. They didn't have Charmin back then in the times of the Gemara, so they used stones instead to wipe. And this has to do with Hilchas Shabbos, because normally stones are muktzah. So what determines whether a stone can be used, even if it wasn't set aside before Shabbos? The Tanya, as the Brisa says, "B'Shabbos gimel avona mikurzalos muter la'achnas lebeis hakisei," that you can bring in 3 pointy stones into the bathroom, even if they were not designated from before Shabbos. Because of kavod abrios, you're allowed to take them, but they have to comply with a minimal size. V'kama shi'uron, Rabbi Meir omer ke'egos, Rabbi Yehuda omer kebeitza. Rabbi Meir says they have to be minimally the size of a nut, and Rabbi Yehuda says no, they have to be, in order to not be considered muktzah, they have to be at least the size of an egg. It's Gemaras like these that make me thankful that I live in the 21st century. Uvegadol kadeshi.
So what's the comparison? Like, why do we?
It's
the
just
esrog to the Shabbos.
There may be issues al pi drush that you could make, but the simple understanding is that we just have a parallel discussion, just like they're the same size, the same machlokes. So to here, the same size, same machlokes. But there's the Yena Shel Torah. You got to go into the deeper part of it and see what's the connection between an esrog and a wiping stone. Maybe just like a stone that you wipe with cleanses you and purges you from any shmutz, maybe that's what the function of the esrog is. You'll have to work on that. Okay. All right. Tanya. So v'gadol kadeshi yoches, the maximal shear of an esrog also was a machlokas. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you have to be able to hold 2 esrogim in one hand. And according to the Chachamim, even if it's so big that you need 2 hands to hold 1 esrog, that's still kosher. So Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Maisa b'Rabbi Akiva, Shabala beis HaKnesses ve'esrogo al kseifa. So Rabbi Yossi tries to argue for his side, and he says, look, I remember a case when Rabbi Akiva once came into the Beis Medrash, and his esrog was so massive that he had to carry it on his back. And this, you see, it's even a massive esrog is kosher. So Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, Misham Raya Avhem Amrulo Ein Zahadar. Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? The rabbi said to him, that's not hadar, it's not attractive, and therefore it's not kosher. So that's the very story, Adarabba, proves my point, doesn't prove your point. Rashi asks the question, We know that Rabbi Yehuda said that you need to fit 2 esrogim in one hand. It wasn't because of hadar. It was because we're worried that you may drop the esrog if it's so large. So you have to be able to switch the lulav and the esrog in case you pick them up in the wrong hands. Remember that discussion that we had? So why is he using the argument of hadar? So Rashi answers, because Rabbi Yehuda was l'divreihem ka'ama. He was saying, according to me, I require that the esrog be moderately small in order to be able to avoid dropping them accidentally. But according to you, the Chachamim, who aren't concerned about that, at least you have to acknowledge that there's a separate issue when it's really humongous, and that is that it's not attractive anymore once it gets to a certain size. And so anyway, so that's the discussion
Rabbi,
here.
according
Yeah.
to the view that it's so big, you can use one that's so big you need 2 hands. How do you hold the lulav then?
You have to sort of maneuver it. You have to maneuver it in such a way that maybe you'll put it on top of the esrog. You'll have to hold them all. You'll have to maneuver it in some way.
Why aren't they concerned about that?
Because they figure, you'll
Nate gave him.
You figure you're not going to drop it because you probably fiddle around with it.
you'll fiddle around with it. Okay, Mishnah. Ein ogden es halulav ela b'mino diver Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir Omer afilu b'chut b'meshicha. So we have another machlokus. We had seen this discussion before. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're only allowed to use the same material that the lulav comes from. It has to be from that tree when you bind the lulav together with the other minim. And Rabbi Meir says, no, you can bind it even with a regular string. It doesn't have to be made from a lulav tree. Amar Rabbi Meir, Maisa ba'anshe Yerushalayim shahayu ogdenes lulaveihem begimonios shel zahav. I have a Maisa of the men of Jerusalem that they used to bind their lulavim with golden threads. So you see, says Rabbi Meir, you don't need it to be from the same material that the lulav comes from. So Amrulo b'mino hayu ogdeno so milamata. So Rabbi Yehuda said back to that, they said back to Rabbi Meir, that's not a proof, because the truth is that the Manshe Yerushalayim did that only as a beautification of the mitzvah. The primary binding that was actually against the surface of the lulav was lulav branches, this whatever we call those lulav holders, and then around that, or on the exterior of that, they put gold thread to beautify it. But the primary binding was a material that was from a lulav tree. The Gemara now says, Amar Rav afilu b'siv va'afilu be'ikra dedikla. So we had seen the statement of Rava before. Don't think that the issue is that it has to be hadar, and that's why you have to use the same material as the lulav so that it looks uniform. That's not the issue. The issue over here is that it has to be, as we'll see in just a moment, the same material for a technical reason, and therefore, based on that, you could use the bark of the palm tree. You could even use the wood of the palm tree to bind the lulav together. The Amar Rava, my time at the Rebbe Yehuda. So what taka is his reasoning? If it's not because of the appearance issue, if it's not because of the optics, then what's the reason why he requires the same species? It's because Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that in order to fulfill the mitzvah of arba minim, you need to bind the lulav together with the other species. And if you were to put a binding, to put something that binds them out of a different material, you'd be binding a fifth item to the other species, and then you'd be adding a species to the 4 species, and that's an isser of Bal Tosef. So that's why he says that it has to be of the same kind as the lulav itself. How can I prove to you, says Rava, that it's acceptable to use the bark or the wood of the tree as your binder? How can I prove that? The Tanya, Basukos Teshva, Sukkah shel kol davar divrei Reb Meir. The Torah says, live in Sukkot, and it doesn't tell, it's obviously talking about multiple kinds of sukkahs, and based on that verbiage, Rabbi Meir says, your SUKKAH can be made out of any kind of vegetation. It doesn't have to be made out of a vegetation that comes from the arba minim. You don't have to take palm fronds. You could also use olive branches. You could use fig branches. You could use pomegranate branches, whatever you want. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ein Sukkah Noheges Ela B'Daled Minim Shebelulav. That Rabbi Yehuda says, I disagree. When you want to get SUKKAH, the SUKKAH has to come dafka from the same species as the arba minim. So you either have to use aravas, you have to use hadassim, or you got to use lulav branches. Vehadinosin, and I'll make a logical argument. Umalulav sheinoig b'leilos kibayamim eno noig ela ba'arbas minim sukkah sheinoigas b'leilos kibayamim eno din shelo tehei ela ba'arbas minim. The logical argument is as follows. He says, look at it this way. Which mitzvah is more chamor? Which mitzvah is more stringent? Sukkah or lulav? Sukkah is more stringent because, after all, it is extant both during the day and at night, whereas lulav only applies during the day. If by the lulav, which is less chamor, you are restricted to only 4 species, then surely the more stringent mitzvah of sukkah should be restricted to the 4 species. So Amrulo, Kol din shata dan tchilas lahachmer b'sof lahakil eno din. So the rabbi said back to Rabbi Yehuda, sorry, that logical argument doesn't fly. Because your logical argument to be more machmir by sukkah than by lulav is going to lead you to a kula by sukkah. It's going to cause you to be lenient. What do we mean? Lo matzah arbas minim yehe yoshev ubatil v'ator amr basukos teish v'shivas yamim. Sukkah shel kol davar. So they said to him, look, what if a person can't find palm branches or hadas branches for schach? According to you, Rabbi Yehuda, then he's got a big kula. He's putter from the mitzvah of sukkah. So your argument to be more machmir by sukkah than you are by lulav is actually going to create more of a kula. And therefore you can't use that illogical argument to demonstrate that you can only use the 4 minim. And therefore we'll stick with Rabbi Meir's teaching, because the Torah says basukos, which implies a multiplicity of sukkahs, and therefore the schach can be made from any material as long as it's kosher as schach. V'chein be'ezra, and furthermore, we'll prove it to you from a pasuk in Ezra. In the times of Ezra, when they all came back to Jerusalem, many people were illiterate, and they had forgotten a lot of halachos. And so Ezra had to teach them how to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah. And he told them, Tzu'u hahar, go out to the mountain, v'haviu alei zayis, v'alei eitz shemen. And he said, go out and bring olive branches and oil tree branches, whatever those are.
Pine needles.
Pine needles, okay. Because it produces pine oil, I guess, okay. Va'alei hadas, and then bring hadas branches, va'alei tamarim, and bring date palm branches, va'alei eitz avos, and bring thick bow branches. Those would be hadassim, but obviously a different species. And then he said to the people, va'alei eitz avos la'aso sukkos kakasuv, and make for yourselves sukkahs as is written in the pasuk. So you see from that pasuk that not only are the 4 species allowable, but even olive branches are allowable as well. Pine branches are allowable as well. So how do you? Of course, say the Chachamim to Rabbi Yehuda, you can use schach out of other materials. The Rabbi Yehuda saver hani ledefanos, and alei hadas v'alei tamar v'alei eitz avos l'sechach. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says no. The olive branches were only kosher for the walls of the sukkah. And the latter part of the pasuk, which talks about the same species as the arba minim, that's what was meant to be used for the schach. So that's how he reads the pasuk. Utanan, but then what's the point I'm trying to bring? Says Rabbi Yehuda. Utanan misachachin b'nesarim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we know that he says in another Mishnah that you're allowed to use planks of wood for schach. Now think about this for a minute. If Rabbi Yehuda says you're only allowed to use arba minim for your schach, but he also says you're allowed to use planks of wood for schach, he must mean that you're allowed to use planks of wood that grow from a date palm. So therefore, al masiv ikra dedikla mina delulvahu yishma mina. So you see, therefore, that what Rabbi Yehuda considers the wood of the palm tree part of the arba minim. And therefore, that's why you can use it as kosher as schach l'shitaso. And therefore, that also indicates that when Rabbi Yehuda requires that you have to use the same species to bind the lulav, you're also allowed